My name is Barry Adkins, and the first thing I want to tell you, and this is important to understand, is that I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I don't know you, and you don't know me, and I have no business telling you how to live your life. But I am here to tell you a story, and as you listen to that story, I want you to think about what you want your story to be. Where do you want to be in 5 years or 10 years? And the second thing I want to talk about, because some of you will probably wonder, do I drink? And the answer to that is yes, I do. I will have a beer at night sometimes, but I never drink and drive. And quite often, with the job that I do that pays my bills, I will end up out in bars and restaurants at night with other people that are drinking. And as the night goes on and they're drinking more and more, they think they're getting cooler and cooler. But those of us that are sober know that that isn't true. People do not get cooler and cooler as the night goes on. I actually have a relative who's a cop. And he told me a story one time about a guy he pulled over that he suspected of a DUI. So he pulls the guy over, and you would think if you've got a beer in your hands, you're going to hide that beer when a cop comes up to the car, right? Not this guy. The cop walks up to the door of the car, looks in, and the guy's got the beer sitting between his legs. Not smart. So he talks to him for a little bit, and you know what he eventually asks him to do? He says, I need you to step out of the car. So now for sure, he's going to hide that beer, right? Not this guy. He handed the beer to the cop and asked him to hold it while he got out of the car. If that isn't evidence enough for you, I don't know what is. So I need everybody to look at me for just 1 second here. Look right at me. I don't want you to listen here because you know all of this up here. I want you to listen here because this is where the story comes from, and this is where life change happens. So here's a picture of my son, Kevin. He was all about that belt buckle and cowboy hat, thumbs in a pocket. He thought that was pretty cool. I don't know if it helped him with the girls or not, but he thought that was pretty cool. When Kevin was younger and he was in elementary school, he was not a very good student. And we had to go in for parent-teacher conferences when he's in elementary school, just like everybody else does. And the teachers always had to find something good to say about him because they weren't going to talk about how good his grades were. I knew that before I walked in there. And they always talked about how kind he was and what a good heart he had. He actually befriended a boy by the name of David when he was in 3rd grade. David was in a wheelchair. There was nothing wrong with David except his legs didn't work. But because he was in a wheelchair, it made it harder for him to make friends. But Kevin was that guy. Kevin was that guy that made sure that David got out to the playground at recess, got him back to class, and made sure he got to the bus. And when they could talk David's mom into it, she would drop him off over at our house. And these boys are in 3rd grade, and sometimes 3rd grade boys have interesting rules. Well, one of the rules these two boys had was that the wheelchair stayed at the front door. And you're wondering, well, how did David get around if he couldn't walk? David was pretty good at getting up on his arms and kind of army crawling around the house. But one of Kevin's other problems was patience. So he'd be in the bedroom with David, and Kevin would decide they're going to the living room, and he didn't want to wait for David to get from his bedroom to the living room. So he would go and grab David by his arms and drag him through the house by his arms. Same thing in the backyard. He would just grab David by his arms and drag him through the grass and the dirt, and put him up on the swing on his stomach because he couldn't hold himself up. They'd put him on the swing on his stomach. They had a lot of fun together. As Kevin got older, he got his driver's license and his cell phone. And he used to come home and tell us stories that honestly scared me to death. Because he's that guy that stops on the freeway and helps a complete stranger change a tire or give him a ride, let him borrow his phone, whatever they needed, he'd help them out with it. In the fall of his senior year in high school, his older sister gave birth to a baby boy by the name of Colin. She was still living at home, trying to get her life together, going to school and working. And this meant that we had to watch Colin at night while she was at school. Most nights when she got home from school, Kevin would be asleep in her room with Colin. Colin has no memory whatsoever of his Uncle Kevin. So as I said, he was not a very good student. He was actually flunking his English class in March of his senior year in high school, and he needed it for graduation. And I was on him about it all the time, and you guys all know what he would say. Yeah, Dad, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. But I'm a parent. I didn't take his word for it. So I would actually call the school and ask to talk to the teacher and ask all those important questions like, did he show up today? Has he turned in his assignments? Because that was one of his biggest problems, was he just didn't turn in the assignments. But the teacher knew what to do to motivate Kevin. So she would actually go back into class and report back to him in front of all of his buddies that his daddy called to check on him. And then I would get the phone call. Would you knock it off? I got this covered. And I'm like, look, dude, just get your grades up. Take care of this. But he did get his grades up, and he did graduate from high school. And at the high school graduation ceremony, he gave me a hug and whispered, "Thanks for not giving up on me, Dad." So he graduates from high school and gets a job right straight out of high school, working for an electrician, making good money. And he met my financial requirements, so I agreed to co-sign a loan so he could buy a new truck. He'd been driving an old truck for years. And by the way, I made him give me 3 months worth of insurance payments and car payments before I would co-sign that loan, because I didn't want to be on the hook for this. This is his deal, not mine. And I'm hoping that he'll go out, find a truck from a private party. I'll go down to the credit union, sign the paper, and be out of there in 5 minutes. But he finds one at a dealership. And this means I got to go down to the dealership and sign papers. So I go down to the dealership, walk into the financial guy's office. First words out of his mouth are, "How about some life insurance?" And I'm thinking, here we go. I said, "Look, man, I don't need any life insurance. My wife will do just fine if something happens to me." And he looked at me and said, "I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about your son." I'm that guy. I'm that guy who rather indignantly told him that 18-year-old boys don't need life insurance because they don't die. But I was wrong. They do die. He wouldn't live long enough to make a single payment on that truck. So he's 18 years old. He's graduated from high school. He's got a new truck and a job. What's the next thing he wants to do? He wants to move out because he's tired of the old man telling him what to do. Because I made him do all those terrible things that parents make you do, like come in and let me know when you're home. Could you take out the trash today? And if you wouldn't mind, go in the bathroom, get your clothes out of the bathroom and look behind the door, because I'm pretty sure there's a pair of dirty socks back there. But he was tired of all that. And I remember him coming into our living room one day, and in our living room, we have this big brown chair that sits in front of a big picture window, looks out over our backyard. He sat down in that brown chair and he started talking about how he couldn't believe his life was finally beginning and he wanted to move out. And I did my best to discourage him because, quite frankly, we really never had any problems with him. His high school principal didn't even know who he was, and I considered that a good thing. But I didn't have any luck talking him out of it. So a couple of weeks later, his buddy Craig came over, and they started the process of moving him out. They threw a bed, a TV, and a dresser in the back of his truck, and that was his idea of moving out for the day. And he went back into his bedroom, picked up a clean pair of jeans off the floor, threw them in the dryer to de-wrinkle, and came back in and told me something I've never forgotten. He said he wasn't going to take his toothbrush with him, that he'd be back tomorrow and get it. He went back in, put his jeans on. I walked out front with him like I normally do, gave him a hug, told him that I loved him and to be careful, and watched him drive away. It was the last time I saw him alive. That night, his buddies decided to throw a little housewarming party for him. Started with a keg of beer and moved on to shots. I'm going to play a little voicemail he left for his sister that night. You'll hear him talking about how he's really drunk, how he just did 6 or 7 shots in a row, and how he loves Colin Adkins more than anything in the whole world.
I couldn't come back. Adkins. I'm surprised. How many shots in a row? 6 or 7 shots in a row. I'm really drunk. I love Colin Atkins more than he is so long. So pretty, I look, I look at more than he is so well. I'm drunk. He's not. End of message.
So it doesn't sound like any big deal, right? Just a bunch of guys partying, having a good time. No big deal, except somebody died that night. That somebody was my son, Kevin. He passed out a short time after he left that voicemail, and the people at the party laid him in his bed on his side in case he vomited. But the party was still going on, so they went in and shaved his head and his legs while he was passed out, because he's just passed out, right? It's not that big of a deal. But his buddy Craig was worried about him, kept going back in to check on him. Around 4 a.m., the calls started coming in to 911. The first calls were difficulty breathing. The next calls were not breathing. My son died alone in a hospital while I slept peacefully in my bed. The next morning was Sunday morning. My wife and I are sitting around talking about what we're going to do that day or not do that day. At about 8:30 in the morning, the doorbell rings. And we're looking at each other because we weren't expecting company. And I open the door and I see 2 police officers and somebody in plain clothes standing at my front door. Should have been a big red flag, right? It should have been. But I'm that guy. It didn't even occur to me that something bad had happened. I actually joked with them as they came in, thinking this has to have something to do with a dog or a parked car. I had nothing, man. I didn't know why they were there. But they didn't laugh at any of my jokes. One of the police officers and the person in plain clothes stayed by the front door. The other officer walked in and stood in front of that brown chair that Kevin sat in two weeks before and talked about how his life was finally beginning. He said there'd been an accident and that your son is dead. One of us asked who it was because we have a number of children. They said it was Kevin, and they handed me his driver's license. There's something pretty final about it when a police officer hands you your child's driver's license. Because until that moment, that exact moment in time, you're holding out hope that this is all just a big mistake. You need the Kevin Adkins that lives on the other side of town. You have misspelled the last name. Get out of here. You need to be 3 streets over, or at least next door. But when they hand you your child's driver's license, you know he's gone, and he's never coming back. One of us finally asked what had happened, and the officer said that the probable cause of death was alcohol poisoning. We found out later that that is indeed what happened. His blood alcohol content was 0.36%. Very drunk. But the coroner also said that they have seen as low as 0.24% kill specifically teenagers. It's the only statistic you'll ever hear me mention, and the only reason I mention it is because when somebody's passed out, there's no way of knowing how much trouble they're in. You need to get them to a hospital. And if you're ever in that situation, think about Kevin's buddy, Craig. It's a night he'll never forget. I can only describe the days, weeks, and months after that as dark. There's just a lot of ugly stuff you have to do. You have to tell that story over and over again. You have to visit a funeral home and plan for a memorial. You have to sort out a little detail like, what are we going to do with his remains? I actually spoke at his memorial, and I'm going to read an excerpt of what I said. Many of you have asked, what can I do to help? Well, here's what you can do. Each of you can make something very good come from this. I don't know if it's one something very good or 1,000 something very goods. It might be a tiny something very good or a huge something very good. But I am convinced that good things can come from this. I don't know who, what, when, where, or how, but I know that it will. I ask each of you to find that something very good and make it happen. That is what you can do for us and for Kevin. Dark days, man. We got the call about a week later to come and pick up Kevin's remains. We decided to have him cremated. And I went down to the funeral home, walked into the funeral home, and, you know, they're playing nice music in the background, nice pictures on the wall. They take me into an office, set me down in a big, comfortable leather chair with a big desk sitting in front of me. And a funeral director walks in and sets an urn down in front of me. An urn that holds all that remains of the kid that I burped, changed his diapers, coached his baseball, soccer, football, taught him to shoot a gun and swing a golf club. All the remains of him were sitting in an urn in front of me. There's one thing I knew at that point, and that was that I didn't want to be a victim. Because the world doesn't need any more victims. We got plenty of them already. The world needs people who take something bad and they make something very good come from it. And I thought about what I would hope somebody else would do if it happened to their kid. And for me, the answer was pretty clear. It was to get out and tell the story, not to raise money, because here's another dirty little secret for you. There is no money in the world that'll fix the hurt. It doesn't exist. The only thing that helps is to try to make something good come from such a senseless tragedy. We wrestled with what to do with his remains. I actually grew up in Montana, and Kevin had been to Montana a number of times and always talked about wanting to move there someday and buy a ranch. So we decided to take his ashes to Montana. I suppose a normal person would have put them in their car and driven up there. But I decided to put them in my backpack and walk there. Again, not to raise money, but to tell the story. Because I guarantee you, you don't want to ever have to go through this. So I've got 3 things that I want you to take away from this. 3 very simple things, but very important things. And the first is about decision making. The 2 most important decisions that you are ever going to make are about drugs and alcohol. It isn't even close, guys. You need to educate yourselves about the dangers of drug and alcohol abuse as if your lives depend upon it. Because it does. And the second is about adversity. Bad stuff's going to happen to you. As much as we wish that nothing bad would ever happen to us, bad stuff's going to happen. You're not going to make the team. You're not going to get that scholarship. Your team's going to lose that last game. The way you respond to adversity is going to define your life. Notice I didn't say maybe. It will. And the most you can hope for when something bad happens to you is to try to make something good come from it. Third, and perhaps most importantly, is about forgiveness. It was easy for me to forgive the guys at the party because nobody forced Kevin to do this, right? This was his decision. And it was easy for me to forgive my son because that's what parents do. But there's one person that was exceedingly hard to forgive. And you probably know who that was. It was me. The number one job of a parent is to keep their kid alive. And I didn't get that done. It took 1,400 miles and 5 pairs of shoes to find a way to forgive myself. But I have. I heard a pastor describe it best once. He said that anger and vengeance lead to one thing: destruction. Forgiveness leads to healing. And sometimes, the most important person you need to forgive is yourself. Nobody's perfect, man. So I actually wrote a book titled Kevin's Last Walk. I'm going to read another excerpt from that book. This is something I call a letter to Kevin. Dear Kevin, well, son, it was one incredible journey. I kept you close to me all the way. Your ashes were there in my backpack to give me strength and courage every time I spoke. We walked together through barren deserts, withering winds, snow, and rainstorms, up over high mountain passes, and down through beautiful sun-drenched mountain valleys for the final time. I played back so many fond memories of you as I walked. Memories of the day you were born, your many baseball and soccer games, and trips to the county fair with your pigs. At the viewing before the memorial, I was there, but I didn't go in. I stood outside with friends and family, hugging, laughing, and crying. I chose not to see you lying in a casket, but to remember you as you lived, your love for a good laugh, a good friend, and for life. You taught me many things in life about being a father and what it means to love a child. Your death has taught me how deep that love goes and that life holds no guarantees. You taught me that God has a plan for each of us and that sometimes someone must die so that others might live. You are no longer with us physically, but you'll always be with us in our hearts. Love, the Dad. So this is Kevin's story. And my question for you is, what do you want your story to be?